On December 1, 1944, on the Rohr Plain in western Germany, Lieutenant Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion looked through the M76F telescopic sight of his M36 tank destroyer and saw a Panther. The Panther was dug in between the villages of Prumern and Sugerath, northeast of Aachen, sitting hull down with its 80mm glacis plate angled toward the American lines. At the range Rose was looking at, that Panther should have been untouchable. No American tank gun in service could penetrate the front of a Panther at anything beyond a few hundred yards. The 75mm on the Sherman bounced off at point-blank range. The newer 76mm could not get through beyond close quarters. Every Panther crew in the German army knew this. They had been trained on it. They had survived because of it. Rose's target was 4,600 yards away. That is 2.5 miles. That is farther than any American tank gun had ever killed a Panther under any conditions. It was, in fact, close to the maximum range of the telescopic sight itself. Rose fired. The 90mm round crossed that distance in seconds. The Panther was destroyed. The after-action report of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, witnessed by multiple observers, confirmed the kill at a measured range of 4,600 yards, 2.5 miles. A Panther, dead, at a distance its crew had every reason to believe was safe. That shot was not a fluke. In the same sector, around the same period, Corporal Anthony Pinto of the same battalion had destroyed a Panther at 4,200 yards, 2 kills beyond 2 miles from the same unit. It was the announcement of a new weapon that was about to change the mathematics of armored warfare on the Western Front, and the Panther crews who would face it had no idea it was coming. If this story holds your attention, a like is the single best way to help it reach others who care about this history. And if you are new here, subscribe. There is much more to come. Across the Western Front, from the frozen fields east of Aachen to the wooded ridges of the Saar, German Panther crews were encountering something that did not fit the rules they had been fighting by for 18 months. They were being hit at ranges where they had always been safe. They were being penetrated from directions they had always considered invulnerable, and they were dying inside tanks that they had been told were the finest on the battlefield. The reports filtered upward through the German chain of command in fragments. A Tiger II of the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion, destroyed near Frealdenhoven on November 19, 1944, by an American tank destroyer firing into the turret side at roughly 1,000 meters. 5 German tanks destroyed in a single engagement near Schwalbach, France, on November 25, 1944, by a platoon of American vehicles that no German crew in the sector had seen before. And Rose and Pinto's extreme-range kills in the 814th were only the most dramatic examples of a pattern that was appearing across the entire front. The weapon responsible for these shots was a gun that most German Panther crews had never been briefed on, had never trained against, and had no tactical doctrine to counter. It was the American 90mm M3. That gun, and the vehicle it rode in on, is the subject of this story. But before we get to what the 90mm did on the battlefield, we need to understand why it arrived so late. Because the delay was not caused by engineering. It was not caused by manufacturing. It was caused by an argument inside the American army that cost thousands of men their lives, and that argument had a name. But first, we need to go back further. We need to understand what the Panther was, what it could do, and why every German crew who climbed inside one believed, with the confidence of men who had seen the proof with their own eyes, that no American tank could touch them. The Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther was born from German panic. In the summer of 1941, German panzer divisions rolling east across the Soviet Union ran into a tank they had not expected. The T-34 was fast, well-sloped, and armed with a 76mm gun that could kill a Panzer III or Panzer IV at ranges those tanks could not answer. The encounter shook the German armoured establishment to its foundations. Within months, the Wehrmacht had issued a requirement for a new medium tank that would be, in the words of the design committee, superior in quality to counter the numerical material superiority of the enemy. By the spring of 1942, 2 competing designs were under development. By January of 1943, The first production Panthers were rolling off the line at the MAN factory in Nuremberg and the Daimler-Benz plant in Berlin. The Panther that reached the front lines was, in many respects, the best medium tank of the war. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun, with a barrel 70 calibers long, fired an armor-piercing round at roughly 925 meters per second. That velocity gave it penetration figures that were devastating. At 100 meters, it could punch through roughly 140 millimeters of armor at standard testing angles. At 1,000 meters, it could still defeat approximately 110 millimeters. In practical terms, the Panther's gun could kill an M4 Sherman from any angle, at any range that a tank crew could reasonably expect to fight at. 1,500 meters, 2,000 meters. It did not matter. The Sherman's armor, roughly 50 to 75 millimeters, depending on the variant and the angle, was not thick enough to survive a hit from the KWK-42 at any distance the gunner could see. The Panther's own armor was the other half of the equation. The front hull, that 80mm plate set at 55 degrees, created an effective barrier that the standard American 75mm M3 tank gun could not penetrate at any range. Not at 500 meters, not at 100 meters, not at point blank. The turret front was approximately 100 millimeters thick, with a heavy cast gun mantlet that added further protection, but also created an infamous shot trap where rounds could deflect downward into the thin hull roof, a flaw the Germans attempted to correct in the Ausf model. But the Panther was not invulnerable. Its sides carried only 40 to 50 millimeters of armor, enough to stop shell fragments and small arms, but not enough to resist a direct hit from any Allied tank gun. Its rear was thinner still. Its roof was only 16 millimeters, which meant that any artillery round landing nearby could send fragments through it. Its transmission and final drive system was chronically undersized for the tank's weight, which had grown beyond the original specification after Hitler personally insisted on thickening the armor. The final drives wore out so frequently that half of all Panthers found abandoned in Normandy showed mechanical breakdown, not battle damage, as the cause of loss. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, wrote a post-war evaluation that praised the Panther's gun and frontal armor while cataloguing its flaws with the weary precision of a man who had watched his division's Panthers break down on the road to the front. He called it poorly suited for hedgerow terrain because of its width. He called the powertrain very sensitive, requiring well-trained drivers. He noted the weak side armor and the vulnerability of the tank's top to fighter bombers. And yet, Bayerlein also called the Panther, in a separate passage, the best tank in existence for its weight, an ideal vehicle for tank battles. That contradiction, magnificent from the front and fragile from everywhere else, was the Panther's defining characteristic, and it was the front that mattered to the crews. Because a Panther commander who kept his front to the enemy and fought from a prepared position at 1,000 meters or more was, against American Shermans, functionally invincible. He could sit in his position, pick off Shermans one by one as they advanced across open ground, and watch the 75mm rounds bounce off his glacis like gravel thrown at a barn door. This was not theory. This was the lived experience of Panther crews in Normandy, in Lorraine, in the Hurtgen forest. A single hull-down Panther at a crossroads could hold up an entire company of Shermans for hours, killing 2 or 3 before the Americans could maneuver around its flanks or call in an airstrike. The crew that survived such an engagement went back to their lines, knowing exactly what their armor could do. They had seen it work. They had survived because of it. And they had been trained, explicitly and repeatedly, to trust it. The Panther Fibel, the illustrated crew manual, approved by General Heinz Guderian and issued from July 1, 1944, drilled this lesson into every crew with schematic diagrams showing where Allied rounds could and could not penetrate. Keep your front to the enemy. Your front is your life. What they had not been trained for was a gun that could break that trust from a mile away. To understand the scale of that shock, you need to understand what American tank crews had been living through in the months before the 90mm arrived. Because those months were a slow-motion catastrophe that the American public was never fully told about. In Normandy, In the summer of 1944, American Sherman crews learned the truth about their tanks in the most brutal way possible. They learned it by dying, a Sherman approaching a hull down Panther, across 1,200 meters of French farmland, was firing rounds that bounced off the Panther's front, and absorbing rounds that did not bounce off anything. The 75mm M3 gun, on the standard Sherman, could penetrate roughly 68mm of armor at 500 yards. The Panther's effective frontal protection was more than double that number. The math was not close. It was not a question of aim or skill or courage. It was a question of physics, and physics was killing American tankers every day. The 3rd Armored Division, which would later receive the 1st Pershings, suffered appalling tank losses in the hedgerow country of Normandy. Belton Cooper, an ordnance maintenance officer in the division, spent the campaign recovering destroyed Shermans and cataloguing the damage. He saw the burned-out hulls, the blown turrets, and the remains of crews who had been trapped inside tanks that caught fire when their ammunition cooked off. The Sherman's ammunition storage, located in sponsons along the hull sides, was vulnerable to penetration from almost any angle. When a round came through and hit the propellant charges, the tank did not just stop, it burned. American crews gave the Sherman a nickname that captured this reality with savage precision. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lit the first time every time. Cooper would later write in his memoir that he believed he had seen more knocked-out tanks than any other living American. His central argument, that the Sherman was a death trap that should have been replaced by the Pershing a year earlier, is contested in some of its specific claims by modern historians. But the broader indictment, that American crews fought and died in tanks whose guns could not kill the enemy's tanks from the front, is supported by every surviving record of the campaign. At the Battle of Aracourt in September of 1944, the 4th Armored Division fought a series of engagements against Panthers of the 5th Panzer Army in the rolling country of Lorraine. The German Panther crews, many of them fresh replacements with only weeks of training in tanks that had not even been properly broken in, took staggering losses. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns deployed by German units near Aracourt, 86 were destroyed, 114 were damaged or broken down, and only 62 were operational by the end of the month. The Americans won that battle decisively, but they won it through terrain, fog, artillery, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, and the skill of tank crews who knew how to maneuver to the flanks, not through frontal firepower. Every Panther killed at Aracourt was killed from the side, from the rear, from above by aircraft, or by infantry weapons at close range. Not one was killed by a 75mm round through the front. That was the world American tankers lived in. A world where the only way to kill the enemy's best tank was to get behind it, and where getting behind it meant crossing open ground under fire from a gun that could kill you at 2,000 meters. The men who survived did so through speed, through smoke, through the hedgerows and forests that broke up sightlines, and through sheer numbers. The Americans could afford to lose Shermans. They could build them faster than the Germans could build Panthers, but the men inside the Shermans were not replaceable in the same way, and the men who had to climb into a Sherman knowing what waited for them on the other side of the next ridge carried a burden that no production statistic can measure. The weapon that broke it did not start its life as a tank killer. It started its life pointed at the sky. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun was standardized by the United States Army in 1940. It was the American equivalent of the German 88mm Flak 18, the gun that had already become legendary for its dual role as both anti-aircraft weapon and tank destroyer. The American 90mm fired a 3.5-inch shell to a vertical ceiling of 43,500 feet. It was a big gun, a powerful gun, and like the German 88, it had obvious potential against ground targets. But the Americans were slower than the Germans to exploit that potential. The Germans had been using their 88s against tanks since the French campaign in 1940. The Americans did not begin designing a tank destroyer mounting the 90mm until September of 1942, when reports of heavy German armor in North Africa made the need for a heavier anti-tank weapon impossible to ignore. The first prototype of what would become the M36 tank destroyer was completed in March of 1943, the same month that the first Tiger I tanks appeared in Tunisia. The tank version of the gun was designated the 90mm gun M3. Mounted in the open-top turret of the M36, it fired several types of ammunition. The most important were 3 rounds. The M82 armor-piercing capped tracer, which was the standard round, left the muzzle at roughly 2,650 feet per second. The T-33 armor-piercing tracer, an improved version with a ballistic windshield, achieved roughly 2,800 feet per second, and the T-30E16 high-velocity armor-piercing tracer, the tungsten cored round that the crews called the Silver Bullet, screamed out of the barrel at 3,350 feet per second. Here is what those numbers meant against a Panther. The T-30E16 high-velocity armor-piercing round, according to official Ordnance Department documentation from January of 1945, achieved complete penetration of the front turret plate and gun mantlet of the Panther tank at a range of 800 yards. That single finding, buried in a technical firing report, was the end of the Panther's immunity. The standard T-33 round could also defeat the Panther's glacis at close to 1,000 yards under favorable conditions, making the 90mm the first American gun capable of threatening the front of the tank that no previous American weapon had been able to touch. With the tungsten-cored T-30E16 round, the results were even more dramatic. The Ordnance Test Summary stated that the shot would defeat all plates of the Panther except the gun mantlet at extended ranges. That meant the turret, the sides, the rear, and the glacis, all of it, at ranges that extended well beyond a mile. Now consider what this meant for a Panther commander who had spent months fighting Shermans on the Western Front. He had learned, through experience and training, that the safe distance from an American tank was roughly 800 meters. Inside that range, a flanking shot or a lucky hit on the side could kill him. Beyond it, the Sherman's gun was not a serious threat to his front armor. He had built his entire survival strategy around that number. Stay beyond 800 meters. Keep your front to the enemy. Let them come to you. The 90mm erased that number. It doubled it. It tripled it. And the Panther commander did not know it was coming. But why did it take so long to arrive? The answer to that question is not a story about engineering. It is a story about doctrine. And the doctrine had a name. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair. McNair commanded Army Ground Forces from 1942 until his death in July of 1944. He was the single most powerful figure in shaping how the American Army fought on the ground, and he held a belief about armored warfare that would cost thousands of American tankers their lives. The belief was simple, and it sounded logical. Tanks should not fight tanks. The job of destroying enemy armor belonged to a specialized force of lightly armored, heavily gunned vehicles called tank destroyers. Tanks themselves were for breakthrough and exploitation, for supporting infantry and racing through gaps in the enemy line. When enemy tanks appeared, the tank destroyers would handle them. This was the tank destroyer doctrine, and McNair built an institutional empire around it. By the middle of the war, the tank destroyer force had mobilized 53 battalions. Training was concentrated at Fort Hood, Texas. Each battalion fielded 36 tank destroyers in 3 companies. The doctrine's operational logic was that tank destroyers would wait in concealed positions, ambush approaching enemy tanks, kill them, and withdraw before the enemy could respond. McNair described the concept himself. The tank destroyer need only maneuver for a favorable position, conceal itself thoroughly, and ambush the tank. But the battalion lost 2/3 of its strength in the process. The tank destroyers had done their job, but the cost was unsustainable. General George S. Patton, who witnessed the results, declared the concept unsuccessful in the conditions of the theater. Tank destroyer units, in practice, were being used as improvised tanks, as assault guns, as infantry support weapons, as anything but the elegant concealed ambushes that the doctrine imagined. Their open-topped turrets, designed for weight savings and observation, killed crewmen by the dozen when the vehicles were used in roles they were never designed for. But the doctrine's worst consequence was not what happened to the tank destroyer crews. It was what happened to everyone else. The doctrine had consequences that reached far beyond the tank destroyer force itself. As long as enemy tanks were the responsibility of tank destroyers, the Sherman did not need a bigger gun. As long as the Sherman did not need a bigger gun, the Ordnance Department's proposed heavy tank, the T-26 series that would eventually become the M26 Pershing, was unnecessary, expensive, and unwelcome. Major General Gladion M. Barnes, head of the Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service, fought for the T-26. General Jacob Devers, who commanded the European theatre in 1943, wrote a withering memorandum to McNair. Offensively, Devers wrote, "The weapon to beat a tank is another tank. Sooner or later, the issue between ground forces is settled in an armored battle, tank against tank." McNair disagreed. He argued that the T-26 was unnecessary, that the M4 Sherman with a 76mm gun was sufficient, that there was no doctrine for the employment of heavy tanks, and that shipping heavier vehicles across the Atlantic was wasteful. Devers went over McNair's head to Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. Marshall overruled McNair in December of 1943 and authorized production of 250 T-26E1s. But even after that authorization, manufacturing did not begin until November of 1944. The bureaucratic fight had consumed more than a year, and every month of that year, American tank crews were fighting and dying in 75mm Shermans against Panthers and Tigers whose frontal armor they could not penetrate. In July of 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower learned that the new 76mm gun being rushed to Normandy on upgraded Shermans could not actually defeat the Panther's front armor. His reaction was immediate and furious. He confronted General Omar Bradley. "You mean our 76 will not knock these Panthers out?" Eisenhower demanded. "Why? I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I am the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you cannot knock out a damn thing with it." That moment, preserved in the memoir of Ordnance Officer Belton Cooper, was the emotional breaking point. 3 weeks later, on July 25, 1944, McNair himself was killed by American heavy bombers that dropped short during Operation Cobra. The man who had blocked the heavy gun died under friendly fire. The doctrine he had built survived him by only a few months. The M36 Jackson and the M26 Pershing, both carrying the 90mm gun he had deemed unnecessary, flowed downstream from Eisenhower's fury and McNair's death. The 90mm reached the battlefield first, not in a tank, but in a tank destroyer. The M36 gun motor carriage was built on the chassis of the M10 tank destroyer, itself an adaptation of the Sherman. Where the M10 carried the older 3-inch gun, the M36 carried the 90mm M3 in a new power traverse turret with a thick cast front and a massive rear bustle that served as both counterweight and ammunition storage. Like all American tank destroyers, it had an open-topped turret, a design choice that saved weight and gave the crew 360-degree observation, but exposed them to mortar fragments, snipers, artillery bursts, and the brutal winter weather of northern Europe. Crews welded their own improvised roof plates from scrap metal in the field. Production began at General Motors' Fisher Tank Arsenal in April of 1944. The first 40 M36s shipped overseas in September. They were issued to 7 tank destroyer battalions by the end of the year. The first of these, the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, put the M36 into combat on October 30, 1944, near Luneville, France, in support of the 44th Infantry Division of the 15th Corps 7th Army. Initial engagements were cautious. The crews were learning a new vehicle with a gun that behaved differently from anything they had fired before. The 90mm had more recoil, more muzzle blast, and a slower rate of fire than the 3-inch gun, but it hit harder, much harder. The first time a crew fired the 90mm at a hard target and watched the round go through instead of bouncing off, the effect on morale was electric. Men who had spent months firing 3-inch rounds at Panthers and watching them ricochet suddenly had a weapon that answered back. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. A crew that believes its gun can kill the enemy fights differently from a crew that knows it cannot. Word spread through the tank destroyer battalions, the way word always spreads among soldiers, not through official channels, but through the gossip of men who share the same fears. Did you hear what happened at Schwalbach? The 776th got the new gun, goes through the front of a Panther at 1,000 yards, kills a Tiger from the side. The details varied. The core message did not. The 90mm was the real thing. The first documented tank versus tank kills with the M36 came on November 25, 1944, near the village of Schwalbach in the Alsace region of France. The German counterattack on the 114th Infantry Sector ran headlong into Company A of the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The battalion's own informal history records what happened next. In the vicinity of Schwalbach, the enemy launched his all-out armored infantry assault. The destroyer crews in the 1st Platoon, led by Sergeant Carl Gunnarsson and Sergeant Joseph Gilbert, were credited with the destruction of all 5 enemy tanks, thereby forcing the Germans to withdraw. 5 tanks, 2 sergeants. One afternoon, the 90mm M3 had arrived. But the kills at Schwalbach, decisive as they were, happened at conventional ranges. The truly shocking engagements, the ones that rewrote the rules, came in the weeks that followed on the Roa Plain, the flat open farmland east of Aachen where sightlines stretched for miles and a well-positioned gunner with the right weapon could reach across a distance that no tank crew had previously considered dangerous. Rose and Pinto of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, whose extreme-range kills opened this story, were operating in precisely this terrain. Whether Rose's round struck the Panther frontally or hit the side at an oblique angle is not clear from the surviving documentation. What is clear is that an American gunner, with the right sight picture, the right ammunition, and the right elevation, could now reach across a span of country that no German crew had been told was dangerous. The news traveled through the American tank destroyer battalions faster than any official bulletin could have carried it. M36 crews of the 702nd, the 703rd, the 610th, and the 825th began exchanging notes on engagement techniques. They developed a tactical preference for targeting the Panther's turret, which at roughly 100mm of mostly rounded armor was more vulnerable than the heavily sloped glacis. They learned that the Tiger II, the King Tiger, could be killed from the side at 1,000 meters, but not from the front at any range with available ammunition. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion proved this on November 19, 1944, near Freyaldenhoven, when an M36 destroyed a Tiger II of the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion with a shot to the turret side at approximately 1,000 meters. And then, just 16 days after Rose's shot, the Battle of the Bulge began. December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. A German artillery barrage of over 1,600 guns opened fire along an 80-mile front in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. 250,000 German troops in 20 divisions smashed into the thinnest section of the Allied line. The offensive was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was Hitler's final gamble. The M36 tank destroyers already in the line were among the few American weapons that could answer the Panther frontally. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had re-equipped from M10s to M36s on September 30, 1944, was rushed from the 3rd Armoured Division to support the 82nd Airborne Division at Werbermont, Belgium. By December 20th, the 703rd was directly in the path of Kampfgruppe Piper, the armoured spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the most dangerous German formation in the entire offensive. Along the northern shoulder of the Bulge, around La Glaise, Stoumont and Stavelot, M36 equipped battalions, the 610th, the 703rd, and the 740th, formed the backbone of the American anti-tank defense. They fought in fog, in snow, on icy roads where a tracked vehicle could slide off a ridge and into a ravine. They fought with open-topped turrets, in temperatures that froze the traversing mechanisms and numbed the fingers of the loaders. And they killed Panthers and Tigers at ranges that the German crews had never been trained to fear. Consider what it meant to crew an M36 in the Ardennes in December of 1944. Your vehicle weighed roughly 29 tons. It was based on a Sherman chassis, so it drove like a Sherman. But your turret had no roof. Snow fell on the breech of the gun. Ice formed on the traversing ring. The loader's hands, bare because he could not manipulate 90mm shells in heavy gloves, turned white and then blue. The ammunition, 47 rounds stored in the turret bustle and in racks along the hull floor, was your lifeline. You had no machine gun cupola, no coaxial weapon that could suppress infantry at close range without using your main gun. If German infantry got close, if they came through the trees with Panzerfausts, you had pistols and a mounted 50 caliber machine gun that someone had to stand up and expose himself to fire. And yet these crews fought from their open turrets without complaint. They had seen what the 90mm could do, and they knew that no Sherman in the American infantry could match it. They understood, with the clarity of men whose lives depended on the understanding, that the ability to destroy a Panther frontally at 1,000 yards was worth the cold, worth the exposure, worth the risk of a mortar round dropping into the open turret. The 90mm gun was not just a weapon to these men. It was the difference between being a target and being a threat. It was the difference between watching your rounds bounce off the enemy's armor and watching his tank burn. In one engagement during the Bulge, an M36 of the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion penetrated a Panther's turret at 1,500 yards in the rolling country south of the German breakthrough. The crews of adjacent tank destroyer positions watched the Panther brew up, the orange fireball rising against the grey December sky, and understood what they were seeing. The range at which they could kill had just doubled. The calculus of survival had shifted. For the first time since Normandy, an American ground vehicle could sit in a position, watch a Panther approach across open country, and kill it before it reached effective range to fire back. The Germans noticed. Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, acknowledged in post-war interviews that the American tank destroyer force was more flexible and more lethal than his pre-offensive intelligence had suggested. The M36s of the 703rd, 610th, and 740th Tank Destroyer Battalions proved highly effective in stopping or slowing the German spearheads on the northern shoulder of the penetration. Kampfgruppe Piper, which had been expected to reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours, never reached the Meuse. The reasons were multiple: fuel shortages, blown bridges, fierce infantry resistance, but among those reasons was the fact that Piper's Panthers and Tigers were being engaged and destroyed at ranges that his crews had not anticipated. This was the moment the 90mm gun proved itself not as a novelty, not as a lucky shot on a clear day across the Roa plain, but as a systematic weapon that changed the arithmetic of armored combat on the Western Front. A post-war United States Army study of 39 tank destroyer battalions found that each destroyed, on average, 34 enemy tanks, 17 towed guns, and 16 pillboxes by the end of the war in Europe. Among M36-equipped battalions, the kill ratios climbed sharply after the gun's introduction. But the 90mm was not finished. It was about to arrive on a platform that would make its impact permanent. Not a tank destroyer with an open turret and thin armor. A tank, a real tank. The first American tank that could fight a Panther on the Panther's own terms. The M26 Pershing, designated T-26E3 in its production form and named for General John J. Pershing, was the United States Army's first true heavy tank to see combat. It mounted the same 90mm M3 gun as the M36, but on a proper tank chassis. 102mm of frontal hull armor at a sharp slope. Roughly 102mm on the turret front. Torsion bar suspension. The Ford GAF V8 engine, a variant of the power plant used in the M4A3 Sherman. Its crew fought behind steel, not open air. Only 20 Pershings reached Europe in the initial shipment, arriving at Antwerp in January of 1945. They were sent to the United States First Army under General Omar Bradley, who split them between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. The deployment was called the Zebra Mission, and it was led by Major General Gladion M. Barnes, the same Ordnance Department officer who had fought for the tank's development for over 2 years while McNair tried to kill the program. Barnes brought technicians from the Tank Automotive Command and Aberdeen Proving Ground. By February 23, the crews had completed familiarization training near Aachen. The Pershing's combat debut came on February 25, 1945, with the 3rd Armored Division in fighting along the Ruhr River. The next day brought the engagement that proved the Pershing could do what the Sherman never could. February 26, 1945, the town of Elsdorf, Germany. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division advanced into the town in 2 task forces. A Pershing numbered 38, christened Fireball by its crew, and led the advance as dusk fell. Near a log roadblock on the Steinstrasse Road, 3 Tiger I tanks of Heavy Panzer Battalion 301 entered Elsdorf from the east. A Sherman parked behind Fireball was destroyed, silhouetting the Pershing in the firelight. Tiger No. 201 fired 3 rounds from approximately 100 yards. The first penetrated the Pershing's turret through the machine gun port in the mantlet, killing the gunner and the loader. Fireball was the first Pershing lost in combat, the cost of arriving late. But the next morning changed the equation. February 27, 1945. The Germans counterattacked Elsdorf with 4 Tigers and 2 Panzer IVs. Pershing No. 40, commanded by Sergeant Nick Mashlonik, moved forward. At a range of 1,000 yards, on the move, Mashlonik's Pershing destroyed a dug-in Tiger with 4 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. Then Mashlonik saw 3 more German armored vehicles leaving Elsdorf on the road to his right. He destroyed them. The Tiger I, which had owned the long-range engagement window in the west for nearly 2 years, had finally met an American tank that could kill it at the same distances. Mashlonik was not an officer, he was a sergeant. He was commanding a tank that the United States Army's own bureaucracy had tried to prevent from reaching the battlefield, and in the space of a few minutes outside a shattered German town, he proved that the 90mm gun on a proper armored platform could do what 2 years of 75mm Shermans had failed to do. He killed the thing that had been killing them. There was one more Pershing that deserves mention, because its story captures the desperate improvisation of an army trying to catch up to a problem it should have solved years earlier. A single T-26E4, known as the Super Pershing, was shipped to Europe in early 1945. It carried a longer-barreled 90mm T-15E1 gun, 73 calibers long instead of the standard 53, designed to match or exceed the penetration of the Tiger II's 88mm KWK-43. But the Super Pershing's own armor was not sufficient against the Tiger II, so the crew and their ordnance support team did something remarkable. They welded boilerplate steel to the front hull and cut a slab of armor from the hull of a destroyed Panther and bolted it to the gun mantlet. They armored their tank with pieces of the enemy's tank. The Super Pershing served with the 3rd Armored Division in the spring of 1945. On April 1st, near Paderborn, it destroyed a German heavy tank at long range. On April 21st, near Dessau, the Super Pershing engaged what its gunner, John Irwin, described as a King Tiger in a short-range duel, killing it with a shot to the underside. The historian Stephen Zaloga has expressed skepticism about the identification, suggesting it was more likely a Panzer IV or a Tiger I, since no King Tigers were known to be operating near Dessau at the time. Regardless of the target, the engagement demonstrated what the 90mm could do when given a longer barrel and a higher muzzle velocity. Only one Super Pershing ever reached the front. It was photographed in a vehicle dump in Kassel after the war and was probably scrapped. It was a prototype of a future that arrived too late for the war it was built for. By VE Day, 310 Pershings had reached Europe. 200 were issued to combat units. The actual number that engaged the enemy in direct combat is unknown. The Pershing's real war would come 5 years later in Korea, where it destroyed T-3485s at ranges that would have made Sergeant Mashlonik proud. 1 week later, on March 6, 1945, came the engagement that would be remembered not because it was the most significant, but because someone was watching with a camera. The 3rd Armored Division had pushed into Cologne as part of Operation Lumberjack. By the morning of March 6th, German resistance had collapsed everywhere except near the cathedral. A single Panther tank of Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle, commanded by Oberleutnant Wilhelm Bartelborth, had positioned itself to cover a street junction near the intersection of Komödienstrasse and Marzellenstrasse. It had already destroyed 2 Shermans of Fox Company that morning. 3 American crewmen were dead. The surviving tankers had pulled back and called for help. The help that arrived was not another Sherman. Down a parallel street waited Pershing Eagle 7 of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Armored Regiment. The tank commander was Sergeant Robert Early. His gunner was Corporal Clarence Smoyer, a 21-year-old from Lehighton, Pennsylvania. The loader was John DeRiggy. The driver was William McVeigh. The assistant driver and bow gunner was Homer Davis. What made this engagement different from every other tank duel of the war was that Sergeant Jim Bates of the United States Army Signal Corps had positioned himself in a window of the German Labor Front building overlooking the intersection. He had a motion picture camera. He was filming. Early climbed to the 2nd floor, spotted the Panther, and came back down. The plan was simple: edge the Pershing into the intersection, catch the Panther from the flank, fire, and reverse. Smoyer later recalled the moment with the understatement of a man who had lived through it. "We were told to just move into the intersection far enough so I could get a shot at him." As Eagle 7 cleared the corner, Smoyer saw the Panther's gun. Bartelborth had been traversing his turret in anticipation of a flank attack, but the Pershing arrived faster than he expected. The German hesitated. He may have mistaken the Pershing for a friendly vehicle. The M26 was new to the front, and German recognition manuals had not caught up. Smoyer fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first struck below the gun mantlet. The second penetrated the Panther's side hull. The third hit the ammunition storage and ignited an inferno. The Panther burned until the next morning. Bates filmed every second of it. The footage was distributed in newsreels across the United States within weeks. It remains one of the most famous pieces of combat footage from the entire war, the only known motion picture film showing an American tank destroying a Panther in real time. For the American public, it was proof that their army could finally kill the Panther head-on. For the men of the 3rd Armored Division, it was vindication. They had spent 9 months fighting Panthers in tanks that could not match them. Now they had a weapon that could. For the German Panzerwaffe, it was a different kind of message. Bartelborth was an experienced commander. He had set up correctly. He had positioned his tank to dominate the intersection. And when the moment came, a 21-year-old American gunner put 3 rounds through his tank before he could get his turret around. Bartelborth survived. 2 of his crewmen did not. Clarence Smoyer received the Bronze Star 74 years later, in September of 2019, at the National World War II Memorial. He was 96 years old. His 4 crewmates received their Bronze Stars posthumously through their families. Smoyer lived with his memories until 2022, when he died at the age of 99. The memory that haunted him most was not the Panther. It was a civilian car caught in the crossfire that morning, a man and a woman trying to flee Cologne, killed by machine gun fire when their car drove between Eagle 7 and a Panzer IV. That Panzer IV had been destroyed by a Sherman moments earlier, and its machine gunner, a German soldier named Gustav Schäfer, survived the war carrying the same guilt Smoyer did. Decades later, the 2 men met and shared their grief over what the war had cost both sides. Now, there is a question buried in this story that we have not yet answered, and it is the question that matters most. If the 90mm gun was so effective, if it could kill the Panther at 1,000 yards and the Tiger at similar ranges, why did the British and the Soviets have equivalent weapons a full year before the Americans did? The British Ordnance QF 17-pounder, a 76.2mm gun, was first fielded in 1943. Mounted on the Sherman Firefly for D-Day, it could penetrate approximately 163mm of vertical armor at 500 meters with its standard round. With the armor-piercing discarding sabot round, it could defeat roughly 256mm of vertical armor at the same distance. Against sloped plates, the figures were lower, but the gun could still kill a Panther frontally at nearly any combat range. The British modified roughly 1 Sherman in 4 to mount the 17-pounder. By the war's end, Half of all British Shermans were Fireflies. The Germans knew exactly how dangerous the Firefly was. German tank crews were briefed to prioritize the long-barreled Sherman over the standard variant. Firefly crews painted the front halves of their gun barrels in camouflage patterns to disguise the distinctive length. On June 14, 1944, 8 days after D-Day, Sergeant Wilfred Harris of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards, with his gunner Trooper Ian McKillop, knocked out 5 Panthers with 5 shots from a single Firefly near the village of Lingevras in Normandy. 1 shot, 1 kill, 5 times in succession. That engagement is preserved in the regimental history of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards and stands as one of the most efficient tank versus tank exchanges of the entire war. No American 75mm Sherman gunner in the entire Normandy campaign would have a comparable opportunity, because no American 75mm Sherman had a gun capable of that kind of lethality at those ranges. The Soviets had gone even further. The 122mm D-25T gun, mounted on the IS-2 heavy tank, entered service in late 1943. It fired a shell so large and so heavy that it could defeat the Panther's front armor at ranges that varied between 600 and 2,500 meters, depending on whose test results you believe. The Soviet approach was characteristically direct. Skip the medium-caliber gun entirely. Go straight to a bore so large that no contemporary armor could reliably survive it. The Americans were last to arrive at the heavy gun, not because they lacked the industrial capacity, not because they lacked the engineering talent, but because a doctrine, designed on paper in the peacetime exercises of 1941, had told them they did not need one, and by the time the men doing the dying had made it clear that they did, the men doing the deciding had already lost a year. The Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, the massive training exercises where McNair's tank destroyer concept was born, had used umpire rules that artificially favored tank destroyers over tanks. Tanks were forbidden from engaging anti-tank guns with direct fire under certain conditions. The tank destroyers won engagement after engagement in those exercises, and McNair took the results as proof that his doctrine was sound. But the Louisiana maneuvers were held on American soil, in peacetime, with referees and rules and men who went home to their barracks at night. Normandy had no referees. The hedgerows had no rules. And the men who discovered that the umpire decisions of 1941 had no bearing on the physics of 1944 did not go home at night. Many of them did not go home at all. The irony, the bitter irony that sits at the center of this entire story, is that the 90mm gun existed throughout the entire period when American tankers were dying for lack of it. The weapon was there, the factories were there, the engineers who could mount it on a tank chassis were there. What was missing was permission. What was missing was a piece of paper, signed by the right general, authorizing the weapon to be built and shipped and put into the hands of the men who needed it. The gap between the existence of the 90mm gun and its arrival on the battlefield was not measured in miles or in engineering hours. It was measured in memoranda, in committee meetings, in the slow grinding of institutional machinery against the men caught beneath it. That is the deepest layer of this story. It is not ultimately about steel and velocity and penetration tables. It is about the distance between the men who write doctrine and the men who die by it. The Panther crews who discovered that American 90mm guns could reach them from a mile away were not just encountering a new weapon, they were encountering the correction of a catastrophic institutional failure. Every round that the 90mm fired at a Panther in the winter of 1944 was a round that could have been fired 6 months earlier if the decision had been made in time. Every Panther that burned on the Roa Plain was a Panther that might have been killed in the hedgerows of Normandy if the M36 had been there in June instead of October. The men who paid the price for that delay were not generals. They were the crew of every 75mm Sherman that rolled toward a Panther, knowing that their gun could not penetrate its front, knowing that the Panther's gun could kill them at 2,000 meters, and knowing that somewhere behind them, in a Pentagon office or an Army Ground Forces memorandum, someone had decided that the weapon they needed was not necessary. Lieutenant Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the man who killed a Panther at 4,600 yards on December 1, 1944, survived the war. He came home to a country that had already begun to forget the details of what men like him had done. The M36 he fired that shot from was probably scrapped within a few years, melted down into steel for bridges or automobiles or refrigerators. The technical manual for the M76F, telescopic sight that he used to lay that impossible shot, was filed in an army warehouse and forgotten. Sergeant Nick Mashlonik, who killed a Tiger and 3 armored vehicles at Elsdorf in a Pershing that the army's own leadership had tried to cancel, went home and lived the rest of his life as a man who had done his job and did not ask for recognition. Corporal Clarence Smoyer, the gunner who burned Bartelborth's Panther in front of the Cologne Cathedral while a camera rolled, waited 74 years for his Bronze Star. He spent those decades thinking not about the Panther he killed, but about the civilians who died in the crossfire. When he met Gustav Schäfer, the German soldier from the other side of the war, they did not talk about victory or defeat. They talked about the cost. And somewhere in the records of the German Panzerwaffe, in the after-action reports, and the prisoner interrogation files, and the post-war interviews conducted by Allied intelligence officers, there is a pattern. It is not dramatic. It is not a single stunning revelation. It is a gradual, quiet shift in language. In the summer of 1944, German Panther commanders wrote about their positions with confidence. They described engagement ranges and armor angles with the certainty of men who understood the mathematics of survival. By the spring of 1945, that confidence was gone. The language in the reports had changed. There were references to unknown American vehicles with heavy guns. There were standing orders to maintain frontal arc discipline at all times, orders that would have been unnecessary if the old rules still applied. There were instructions never to assume that the front armor was safe. Never assume your front is safe. For a Panther crew, trained from their first day to believe that their glacis was their life, that sentence was the end of a world. The 90mm gun did not win the war. The war was won by millions of men and women across dozens of nations, by logistics and air power and industrial output and sacrifice on a scale that no single weapon can claim credit for. The Sherman tank, for all its flaws, carried the American army from Normandy to the Elbe through sheer numbers and mechanical reliability. The fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force destroyed more Panthers than any ground weapon. The infantry, trudging through mud and snow with bazookas and rifle grenades, killed more tanks at close range than the tank destroyers did at long range. But for the German Panther crews of the last 6 months in the West, the 90mm was the moment the rules changed. The mile of open country between them and the American line, the mile that had always belonged to the Panther, stopped being theirs. An 80mm plate at 55 degrees, 140mm of effective protection, a shield that had never been broken by any American gun, and then, on a cold morning on the Roa Plain, a crack from a distance that should have been safe, and a hole in the turret that should not have been there. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time, and the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor you grew up hearing stories from, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and women carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.